Trust is a fragile thing, and when it's shattered by the people closest to us, the consequences can be deadly. For 17-year-old Darian Jefferson, family wasn't just a source of comfort. It was a trap. Blood can tie families together, but it can also bind them in secrets too dark to imagine. Darian Jefferson, a quiet 17-year-old with dreams bigger than his circumstances, found himself trapped in a web of manipulation spun by someone he was supposed to trust the most. In the heart of Atlanta's West End, the Jefferson family had always prided themselves on resilience. Regina Jefferson, a single mother of 2 boys, worked tirelessly to provide stability for her family, regardless of the chaos of the busy urban streets. Her eldest son, 17-year-old Darian, was her pride and joy, an intelligent young man with dreams of becoming an engineer. Her youngest, Malik, only 12, was still finding his way in the shadow of his older brother. Life wasn't easy, but Regina created a home filled with love and discipline. However, when her brother Charles showed up on her doorstep one evening with nowhere else to turn, that balance began to shift. Regina's younger brother Charles had been a steady presence in their lives since her husband's death. Known for his easy charm and gregarious personality, Charles was the type of man who could light up any room he entered. To people, he was the fun-loving uncle who always had a story to tell or a joke to share. For Regina, his presence was a godsend. He helped watch the kids when her shifts ran late, attended school activities, and even acted as a father figure to Darian and his siblings. Regina welcomed Charles into their home, believing her duty was to help the family, no matter the cost. Charles got attached to Malik, telling him stories of his younger days and playing video games late at night. Darian, on the other hand, was more cautious. While he respected his uncle, he couldn't ignore the strange unease he felt around him. But Charles's life was not perfect. Beneath the acts lay a man possessed by demons. In his younger years, Charles had battled drug addiction and had a series of failed relationships. He moved into Regina's home after losing his apartment and job in Atlanta, a fresh start that seemed to benefit everyone. Regina believed that giving Charles a stable environment might help him rebuild his life. Over the weeks, Charles began to focus his attention on Darian. It started innocently enough, with Charles offering advice about school, girls, and life. Darian, who had grown up without a consistent male role model, began to see his uncle as someone he could trust. Darian started looking up to Charles. He admired his uncle's confidence and the way he seemed to see life as a bed of opportunities. Regina, on the other hand, was relieved to see her brother taking an interest in her son's life, encouraging the bond. As time went on, Charles and Darian grew closer. They spent hours talking about life, dreams, and ambitions. Charles encouraged Darian to dream big, often telling him that he had the potential to achieve anything he wanted. To a young man who craved validation, Charles's praise and words of affirmation meant everything. What no one in the Jefferson family knew was that Charles had been living with a dark secret. Several years earlier, Charles had been diagnosed with HIV, which had thrown his already frustrated life into chaos. Consumed by shame and fear of rejection, Charles chose to keep his diagnosis a secret from everyone, including his family. He avoided treatment, convincing himself that ignoring the problem would make it go away. Charles had seen how others in his social circles had been ostracized after their diagnoses, and he refused to let that happen to him. Instead, he buried the truth and carried on as though nothing had changed. At first, Charles's intentions with Darian were seemingly innocent. He wanted to be a mentor, someone the teenager could turn to during the confusing years of adolescence. But as their bond deepened, Charles's darker impulses began to grow. Charles's behavior toward Darian began to blur the lines of familial affection. His compliments grew this time different and increasingly inappropriate. He commented on Darian's looks, his physique, and his maturity in ways that left Darian feeling both flattered and uncomfortable. Charles was careful, always framing his remarks as harmless jokes or encouragement, ensuring Darian wouldn't suspect anything different. Darian, like many teenagers, was struggling with his identity and self-esteem. The attention from Charles filled a void he didn't realize he had, and he began to seek out his uncle's approval before doing anything. Charles exploited this vulnerability, positioning himself as both a mentor, a friend, and a confidant. One evening, while Regina was working a late shift, Charles suggested that he and Darian watch a movie together. Malik had already gone to bed, leaving the two alone in the dimly lit living room. As the hours passed, Charles's actions grew bolder. He inched closer to Darian, his words becoming more suggestive. Darian, confused and unsure of how to react, froze. What happened that night marked the beginning of a nightmare for Darian. Charles convinced him that their interactions were a special bond that no one else could understand. He manipulated Darian with a mixture of threats and promises, warning him that telling anyone would destroy their family. Darian, scared and ashamed, remained silent. Over the following months, Charles continued to groom and abuse Darian. To the outside world, he was the supportive uncle who had stepped in to help a struggling family. Behind closed doors, he was a predator, exploiting and taking advantage of his nephew's trust and innocence. Darian's once vibrant nature began to fade. He became withdrawn, his focus on school slipping as he struggled under the weight of his secret. Regina noticed the change, but chalked it up to the pressures of adolescence. She had no idea that the very person she had welcomed into her home was the cause of her son's turmoil. Charles, meanwhile, became more brazen. He tightened his control over Darian, using psychological manipulation to ensure his silence. Darian felt trapped, his growing anger and confusion festering inside him. When Darian began experiencing health issues, Regina insisted he see a doctor. He had been losing weight, constantly fatigued, and plagued by persistent fevers. The diagnosis was devastating. Darian had contracted HIV. You seem to be enjoying the documentary. Subscribing to our channel gives you better access to more interesting ones just like this one. Regina was blindsided by the news. She couldn't understand how her son, who she believed to be an innocent teenager, could have contracted the virus. She asked him countless questions, desperate for answers, but Darian refused to speak. The shame and fear were too much for him to bear. Charles feigned shock and concern, offering to help Regina through the difficult situation. His calculated facade only deepened Darian's sense of betrayal. Trapped in a web of manipulation, Darian's mental health began to deteriorate. As Regina struggled to support her son, her relationship with Charles remained unchanged. She relied on her brother for emotional and financial support, unaware that he was the source of her family's pain. Darian, watching his abuser maintain his grip on their household, felt his anger growing. One night, Darian overheard Charles speaking on the phone in the kitchen. His tone was casual, his words flippant, as he discussed Darian's condition and dismissed the gravity of the situation. Something inside Darian snapped. The rage he had suppressed for months boiled over, consuming him entirely. What began as a heated confrontation escalated into a physical altercation. Years of pain and betrayal erupted as Darian lashed out at his uncle. Fueled by anger and a sense of betrayal, grabbed a nearby lamp and struck Charles repeatedly. The sound of shattering glass and Charles's cries echoed through the house. By the time Regina rushed into the room, the damage was done. Charles lay lifeless on the floor, his body a testament to the violence of the attack. Darian stood over him, shaking and bloodied, the reality of his actions sinking in. The room was eerily silent, except for Regina's gasps of disbelief as she processed the scene before her. Her brother lay motionless in a pool of blood, his once charismatic presence now extinguished. Darian stood frozen, his chest heaving, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, rage, and regret. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on both of them. Regina's maternal instincts kicked in, and she rushed to Darian. She gripped his shoulders, searching his face for answers, but he could barely form a sentence. His hands, still trembling, were smeared with blood, a visceral reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. Regina's mind raced. She knew calling the authorities was the logical next step, but the implications were too heavy to bear. Darian was her son, her responsibility, and she couldn't fathom the idea of him being taken away in handcuffs. Her protective instincts warred with her sense of justice, leaving her paralyzed. Regina decided at that moment that it would haunt her forever. With Darian's help, she moved Charles's body to the basement, wrapping it in an old tarp. They worked in silence, the gravity of their actions leaving no room for words. Every movement felt surreal, like they were acting out a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Once the body was hidden, Regina sat Darian down and demanded an explanation. The truth spilled out of him in broken sentences, his voice choked with emotion. He revealed the months of abuse, the manipulation, and the fear that had kept him silent. When he admitted that Charles had knowingly transmitted HIV to him, Regina's shock turned to fury. The betrayal was too immense to comprehend. The brother she had trusted, the man she had welcomed into her home, had preyed on her son in the most heinous way. Her grief was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to break down. Darian needed her now more than ever. Regina knew they couldn't keep the secret forever. The stench of guilt, both literal and figurative, would eventually seep through the cracks. But for now, she focused on survival. She instructed Darian to go about his life as normally as possible, while she figured out their next steps. At work, Regina struggled to maintain her composure. Her co-workers noticed her distracted demeanor, but she brushed off their concerns, citing personal stress. At home, the tension between her and Darian was palpable. Malik, too young to understand the reason for their interactions, began to withdraw, sensing that something was deeply wrong. The days turned into weeks, and the body in the basement became an ever-present reminder of their secret. Regina spent countless nights researching ways to dispose of it, but every plan seemed fraught with risk. The walls of their modest home felt like they were closing in, the weight of their actions suffocating them. In their neighborhood, the sudden disappearance of Charles did not go unnoticed. He had been a charismatic figure, well-liked by many despite his troubled past. Neighbors began to ask questions, their curiosity filled with suspicion. Regina deflected as best she could, claiming that Charles had left to pursue a job opportunity in another city. But the rumor still went on, and whispers about his absence began to circulate. Some speculated that he had run to another city, while others suggested he had simply skipped town to escape his responsibilities. Regina felt the walls closing in, her web of lies becoming increasingly tangled. Darian, too, was struggling under the weight of the secret. The trauma of his abuse, combined with the horror of what he had done, left him isolated and withdrawn. He avoided his friends, his schoolwork suffered, and his once bright future seemed to slip further out of reach with each passing day. The breaking point came when Malik, curious about the sudden tension in the household, stumbled upon the basement door ajar. The foul odor that wafted out was unmistakable, and his innocent curiosity led him to ask questions that Regina and Darian couldn't answer. Terrified that Malik would dig deeper, Regina sat him down and told him a carefully crafted version of the truth. She explained that Charles had done something terrible and that he had left the family to avoid facing the consequences. Malik, young and impressionable, accepted the story, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. It wasn't long before Malik, in his innocence, mentioned the family secret to a neighbor. Though he didn't reveal much, his words were enough to spark curiosity. The neighbor, a woman with a penchant for gossip, began to piece together the pieces of the story, and soon the rumors about Charles's disappearance took on a darker tone. It didn't take long for the police to catch wind of the rumors. Charles's disappearance, coupled with the growing whispers in the neighborhood, prompted them to open an investigation. Detectives began asking questions and interviewing neighbors and family members. Regina's composure began to crack under the pressure. Each knock at the door sent her heart racing, and every interaction with the police felt like an interrogation. She knew it was only a matter of time before their secret was uncovered. Darian, meanwhile, was spiraling. The guilt of his actions, combined with the trauma of his abuse, left him struggling to hold himself together. He avoided the detective's questions as much as possible, but his erratic behavior only drew more attention. He seemed helpless, wrapped around by the mysteries of his mind. The turning point came when a neighbor reported seeing Regina and Darian moving something heavy into the basement on the night Charles disappeared. Though the tip was vague, it was enough to warrant further investigation. One evening, as Regina and Darian sat in the living room, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet. Moments later, a team of officers arrived at their door, armed with a search warrant. Regina's attempts to stall them were futile, and the officers quickly made their way to the basement. What they found was undeniable. The decomposing remains of Charles Jefferson were discovered, wrapped in the tarp Regina and Darian had hastily used weeks earlier. The stench was overpowering, and the sight of the body sent shockwaves through the officers and detectives present. Regina and Darian were immediately taken into custody. The media descended on the story, dubbing it one of the most shocking cases the city had ever seen. The Jefferson family, once seen as resilient and loving, became the center of a scandal that would leave their neighborhood reeling. The weeks that followed the discovery of Charles's body were filled with turmoil. Regina and Darian found themselves under intense pressure as the police investigation dug deeper into the tragic events that had unfolded behind closed doors. The media surrounding the case only added to their agony, turning their personal nightmare into a public affair. For Regina, every moment felt like an eternity as she waited for the inevitable, the trial that would determine their futures. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial, the air thick with anticipation. News media had covered every detail of the case, from the allegations of sexual abuse to the gruesome murder. Darian sat at the defense table, his eyes hollow from the weeks of torment. He had become a mask of shame and regret, and his hands, which had once played sports and written in his school notebooks, were now clenched tightly in his lap. The weight of the truth, of what he had done, bore down on him with each passing second. Regina, sitting beside her son, appeared disheveled and worn. Her clothes hung loosely on her frail frame, and her eyes now appeared sunken and defeated. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as they entered, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole world was waiting for them. The prosecution laid out its case first. They painted a picture of a young man who had been manipulated, abused, and ultimately pushed to the edge by a trusted family member. The details of the abuse were relayed to the jury in graphic terms, and it was clear from the reaction of those present that it was a story too horrific to ignore. Charles's actions, the prosecution argued, were deliberate and monstrous, and his death, while tragic, had been the result of a desperate act of self-defense. Regina, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, was finally called to testify. Her voice, though shaky, carried the weight of a mother's broken heart. She described the man Charles had once been, the brother she had loved, and the shock she had felt when she discovered what he had done to her son. As she spoke, the jury listened intently, their expressions a mix of sympathy and disbelief. But when it came time to discuss the murder itself, Regina's testimony faltered. She hesitated, unsure of how much she could reveal without further incriminating Darian. The truth was, she didn't fully understand what had led to that fateful night. What she knew was that Darian had been pushed to his breaking point by the very person he had trusted the most. The trauma, the fear, the anger, everything had built up to that violent moment. Regina couldn't help but wonder if she had missed the signs, if she had done enough to protect her son from the horrors that had been happening under their roof. Darian's turn to testify came soon after his mother's emotional testimony. As he sat on the witness stand, he avoided eye contact with the jury. His hands trembled, and his throat was tight with emotion. It took all his strength to speak, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. He confessed to the murder, his voice breaking as he recounted the events that had transpired in that small, dimly lit room. The details were painful for him to relive, and he often paused to collect himself. The jury watched him with a mixture of sympathy and horror as he described how he had been abused by Charles for months, and how, in a moment of desperation and fear, he had grabbed a weapon and struck him down. Darian's confession was raw, a painful cry for help that no one had heard until it was too late. He admitted that the anger had been building for weeks, that the fear of his uncle's advances had consumed him. He spoke of the shame he had felt, the guilt that had twisted inside him as he realized the full extent of what had been done to him. In his mind, the only escape was violence, the only way to stop the cycle of abuse. The defense argued that Darian had acted in self-defense, that he had been pushed too far and had no other choice but to defend himself. The defense attorney painted a portrait of a young man who had been broken by the weight of his circumstances, a victim of not only abuse, but of a system that had failed to protect him. They pleaded for mercy, asking the jury to consider the years of torment Darian had endured before he had resorted to such extreme measures. The courtroom fell silent as the jury left to deliberate. Regina's heart raced in her chest, the uncertainty of the situation gnawing at her. She sat with her head bowed, praying that the jury would show mercy, that they would understand what had led her son to commit such a horrific act. But deep down, she knew the truth was more complicated. She knew that Darian's actions, though understandable given the circumstances, had irrevocably altered the course of their lives. For the first time since Charles's death, Regina allowed herself to think about the future, a future that now seemed so uncertain. What would happen to Darian? Would he be sent to prison, to spend the rest of his life paying for a crime that, in some ways, felt both justified and tragic? Or would the jury see the anguish in his eyes and show him mercy? After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood up, his expression solemn. The tension in the air was palpable as the judge called the court to order. Regina's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as she waited for the verdict. The foreman spoke, his words heavy with finality. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Regina's heart sank. Manslaughter. It wasn't the life sentence she feared, but it wasn't the acquittal she had hoped for either. Darian would serve time, but there was still a glimmer of hope for his future. The judge handed down the sentence, 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. It wasn't justice in the way Regina had envisioned, but it was something. As she looked at her son, she saw a glimmer of relief in his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale. The trial was over, but the scars would remain for both Regina and Darian. The impact of their actions would reverberate throughout their lives, altering their family forever. It was a tragic tale of abuse, betrayal, and survival, one that would haunt them for years to come. In the end, Darian had been both a victim and a perpetrator, caught in a cycle of pain that no one had seen coming. If you're enjoying our documentary and want to be part of the conversation to explore the hidden truths of our world, subscribe to our channel and stay with us. We'll see you next time.